né, da professora Berit Heitmann. So Berit, thank you very much for doing this presentation, this seminar. We're very glad. Just a brief comment on what is going on here. So we are receiving this week Berit from Denmark and Amanda from Westminster University. So they are collaborating with us in a clinical trial. She might be able to touch on the topic. And we're just about to start the study, and we got this funding from the Danish Dairy Foundation. We're going to do an intervention on calcium and vitamin D in women with periodontitis, with treatment of periodontitis as well, see inflammatory markers, and it's a feasibility study. So we took the opportunity to have Berit here to present this seminar. She comes from the research unit for dietary studies, the Parker Institute, and also the Frederiksberg Hospital from Denmark. So Berit is going to talk about effects of vitamin D on offspring health, the D-tect project. Perhaps 45 minutes. We can leave about 15 minutes for discussion. And thank you very much. Berit, please.
Thank you, Gilberto. Thank you for having me here. It's very nice to be in Rio. I've been here before, but a lot of things have changed since I was here the first time. And I haven't had so much time to look around, but tomorrow, that'll be my time off to see. Is it better over here? Okay. Right. So, as Gilberto said, I run a unit called the dietary unit, the research unit for dietary studies, and I have a chair at the Copenhagen University, which is where my professorship is, but on a daily basis I'm based at Frederiksberg Hospital, where we run our trials and our research. And what I'll talk about today is particularly a project we've called the D-tect project. It's about detecting disease that is related to vitamin D, but not just vitamin D at any time, vitamin D in fetal life. So the vitamin D your mother has during pregnancy, whether that vitamin D level has any influence on the later health. That is what the D-tect project is about. What I'll be discussing here is just some background for why vitamin D might be related to disease. I'll talk a little bit about the vitamin D status in pregnant women in Denmark, and the vitamin D intake in pregnant women in Denmark, and then I'll present some of our results from the study. You may be aware that the whole idea about developmental origin was originally conceived, if you like, by David Barker. Barker and Hales were the two people behind conceiving the idea that when something was happening, something nutritional was happening during pregnancy, it could have influence in the long run for the child's health. And so they defined what they called the developmental origins of health and disease, later on referred to as D-tect. And it's really whether there is an early life origin, and particularly an early life origin within nutrition, that has impact for adult or later diseases in life. And what they were looking at that time was some quite large studies from the UK, where they were seeing that there was a different risk of getting adult disease. And we're talking adult disease very far out in the future, like getting a stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on, for those children whose mother had poor maternal nutrition during fetal life. And so these thoughts that they have at that time and formulated in their papers are really the basis for what we are doing in the D-tect study. So it's about programming. It's about that something might be going wrong, something might not be optimal in fetal life, and because it's not optimal in fetal life, it may have a long-term programming effect of what happens later in life. However, the mechanisms behind programming, what it is that is happening, is not very well understood. We have several hypotheses that links early nutrition to later disease, but it's very difficult to prove these processes. But more and more animal studies are emerging that are showing that some of these programming influences what they might be. And so we're specifically interested in the prenatal vitamin D and whether variations in prenatal vitamin D might influence later disease. We're particularly interested whether a low vitamin D in prenatal life, a low vitamin D during pregnancy, might have long-term negative health outcomes. And there are a number of proposed hypotheses why vitamin D might have these effects. One is that we find vitamin D receptors in almost any organ in the body, in almost any tissue in the body. So there are vitamin D receptors practically all over the body. And that means that at least we know that vitamin D has multiple effects. And since all these organs and tissue is developed, obviously a lot of it is developed before birth, it is possible that vitamin D, if that's not on at optimal levels, that might influence some of the development of these organs, and that might have long-term influences. And that means that we can think that a low vitamin D in prenatal life might have impacts not just for bone, which is the most likely hypothesis, but it might have for brain, for heart, for the immune system, for the metabolic system, and so on. Now, all this, of course, is only relevant if we think that the variation in vitamin D is great between pregnant women, or that a lot of pregnant women might suffer from a low vitamin D status. And so Camilla Bjørn is one of our PhD students. She's done a lot of studies on this. But the basis for this, of course, is that in Northern European populations, the vitamin D status is generally low. The sun is only strong enough to induce synthesis of vitamin D in the skin during about 6 months of the year. And that means in the wintertime, we cannot synthesize vitamin D in the skin. And that, of course, means that we have to rely on getting our vitamin D during these periods from foods, from supplementation, or even from food fortification. And we know that the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency is as high as almost 15% in Danish adults. And when it comes to insufficiency, it's about half. Obviously, this depends on how we define vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency, and I'm not going to talk about that. So, but these are just some limits that are frequently used, and if we use these limits for the Danish populations of adults, then we find these quite big groups that are that may be insufficient in their vitamin D levels. This is just a slide showing that in the Northern European, Northern American, Northern Asian countries, vitamin D levels are low because of the lack of sun, and the lack of strong sun, at least in the wintertime, and the inability during these periods of converting, of producing vitamin D in the skin. So these are the data from Camilla's work. What she was looking at was the intake of vitamin D from diet from a very large cohort of almost 70,000 pregnant women that all gave food frequency information about their usual intake. And from those this information, she could calculate or show the distribution of vitamin D intake and the median intake of vitamin D from the diet, which is not very high. And again, this is a population that already has low levels. So this is, even if the Danes consume a lot of dairy and a lot of animal products, we don't consume so much fish, but we do consume a lot of dairy. Even then, our daily intakes are quite low. So the pregnant Danish women They do get a lot of vitamin D from supplements, and this is the distribution of the supplement intake among pregnant women in Denmark, and you can see that they get more of their vitamin D from supplementation than they do from the diet. And put together, this is the distribution of vitamin D intake. This is Danish, that's why it says intake, but not intake. In Danish women, where the mean intake is about a little more than 9 micrograms per day. Now, we know that if vitamin D is low in the mother, in the pregnant mother, it's also going to be low in the offspring. And so that's why the hypothesis around vitamin D and long-term health consequences for the offspring might have some bearing. So I guess this is a more or less a replication of what you saw before. This is the prevalence that I showed you before in the overall Danish population, where the prevalence of insufficient levels is about half. It's a little lower in the pregnant women, mainly because they're younger. But still, it's a very big proportion of Danish women that have low levels. So the question we pose in the D-tect project is, does extra vitamin D during fetal life have long-term consequences? Now, in order to do that, you either need very, very big intervention studies, or you need to have something else that can replace that. And the idea behind the D-tect study is to use the fact that in Denmark it was mandatory to fortify all margarine with vitamin D up until 1st of July 1985. So we have people that were eating products with margarine, and that could be in bread in any place, giving birth to children born before that date, and then people eating products without the fortification and giving birth to children born after that date. And so we have a societal experiment, if you like, that can test whether extra vitamin D from fortification is influencing long-term health. So let me show how this works. The D-tect study includes that food fortification study, the margarine fortification study, and it also includes a sub-project or a part of the project where we're looking at actual levels of neonatal vitamin D. I will show you a lot of results from the food fortification study, but not so many from the neonatal vitamin D study, because we don't have the results yet. So I'll just touch upon that study. But just to tell you first about the food fortification study. So margarine was was a product that particularly earlier was consumed quite frequently in the Danish population. On top of that, it was a very frequently used product in bread making, and the fortification policy that was in place in Denmark said that that all margarine had to be fortified. So not only the margarine that people were using in the households, but also the margarine that the industry was using to produce their foods. So the main purpose was to test the effect of getting that extra vitamin D from food fortification during pregnancy for the long-term health of the offspring. That was the food fortification hypothesis. The other one is to examine neonatal blood from cases who developed disease and compare that to controls that did not develop disease, and then see whether neonatal blood levels differed for the cases in control. So quite a simple setup, but something that's possible because every child in Denmark delivers a little blood spot for testing of congenital disease at birth, and the blood that's left over is stored in a biobank and has been stored in a biobank since 1981. And we can now use that for research purposes. The D-tect study was funded by the Danish Medical Research Foundation, the Lundbeck Foundation, which is a medical foundation industry, the Danish Diabetes Academy, and the Region H, which is the corporation of hospitals in the Copenhagen area. So this food fortification study, based on the food fortification policy, is a societal intervention to examine if vitamin in fortified foods, and in this particular incidence margarine affects the development of disease in offspring to mothers that consumed extra vitamin D during pregnancy. And the concept, as I said before, is that up until July 85, it was mandatory to fortify all margarine. It was not much that was fortified, it was only 1.25 micrograms. The thing was that from July 85, the government decided that it now was abandoned to put vitamin D into margarine. And that means we have a set point by which in the period before all margarine had to be fortified, and after that set point no margarine could be fortified anymore. And that's a very nice societal experiment. It's a little bit like the Dutch hunger studies where it was possible to compare what was happening during a period of starvation with other periods of not starvation, or the Great Leap Forward in China, and so it's the same kind of societal experiment that we're using here. Now we've calculated that the fortified margarine actually supplied 15% on average of all the consumed vitamin D. So, and that was because it was not just the margarine that people were purchasing themselves, but also the margarine that went into prefabricated foods, especially bread. So it's not a high amount, but it's a significant amount. The variation was between 3% and 29% of total daily intake in different population groups. The neonatal blood, as I said, is a little blood spot that each child in Denmark delivers. It's put on these cards, and a very small amount of this blood is then used to test for the congenital disease, and that means that there's quite a lot of blood left. And the Danish Serum Institute has developed some very sensitive analysis, so just by taking a little bit of this blood, they can analyze the amount of vitamin D in the blood. And so what we will be doing, and are in the process of doing, is to measure 25-hydroxyvitamin D3 and D2 for that matter. Both we get both in these neonatal blood spots for cases who go on and develop disease. That could be those who develop obesity, diabetes 1, schizophrenia, fractures, diabetes 2, asthma, other diseases, ADHD. In fact, we can look at any disease that we can find in the Danish registries. What we're doing then is to create a cohort sample of individuals without disease, and what we will then do is to compare cases for a disease with that random sample of controls, or the random cohort, to see whether the level of vitamin D in these blood spots were different when they were newly born in relation to whether they develop disease or they don't develop the disease. Okay, but this study I don't have a lot of results from that I can present now, but I do have some results from the food fortification part of D-tect. So the concept is really quite simple. We're looking at individuals from the entire couple of birth cohorts born before July 85, and the individuals from entire birth cohorts born after 85. So, and then we can follow. Then we can follow them for disease for the subsequent about 25 to 30 years, and we can then compare the risk for these individuals with the risk for the other individuals. And what makes it possible to make such studies in Denmark is that everyone in Denmark has been registered with a personal number. It's called this National Civil Registration System. We all have a card like that, and the number you see here, which is just 9s, is a specific number that each of us has. And this number is an official number, and means that we can use this number to connect every individual in Denmark to their health history. So we can go into the National Patient Registry, which gives us information on all hospitalization. We can go into the Danish Diabetes Registry, which have information from the general practitioners about who develops diabetes and who does not. The Multiple Sclerosis Registry, the Childhood Diabetes Registry for type 1 diabetes, There's the school health record registry, which records obesity measured at school health examinations and birth weights for everyone in this case in Copenhagen. They do it all over the country, but it's been put into a register in Copenhagen. The National Birth Registry that gives us information about maternal obesity, but also maternal smoking more recently, birth complication, birth weight, and so on. Statistics Denmark, the fertility database there that informs us about socioeconomic position, education, household income, and so on. And then the Biological Specimens Bank for the neonatal screening, where we get the blood for the newborn babies that we can then analyze, in our case for vitamin D, but it could be analyzed for anything that can be retrieved from old, from blood spots that have been kept for maybe 25 years. There are a number of studies showing that storing vitamin D on paper, dried blood spots on paper, they do not vary with respect to, or they give reliable information about vitamin D even if they have been stored for long. So, just to pin it out, we're looking in most of the studies for those 125,000 individuals that were born between June 1983 and May 1985. Then we have a washout period to allow for margarine on the shelves to be washed out and not be available anymore. And then we're comparing these individuals to those over here that were born between September 86 and August 88. So these people here are the exposed. But the exposed in this case refers to those that get the extra vitamin D, and in other words, those that we expect to have the better health profile. Normally when we talk about exposed, we think that those are the ones that fare worse. But in this case, the exposed will be those we expect to fare better in relation to developing disease later on compared to the non-exposed. Now this design has a lot of very strong capacities, if you like. And one of the very strong features is that because we are studying the entire population born in Denmark over a couple of years, confounding is not a big issue, because we expect that all confounders will be equally distributed in the exposed and the unexposed. We have no reason to believe that it shouldn't be otherwise. We're not selecting people in any way. We're just studying individuals that are born in adjacent years, very close to each other, and we're studying all of them. And that means that we're not particularly worried about confounding. We're not particularly worried about the consumption of foods, breastfeeding practices, or other things, because we expect them to be equal. We don't expect a lot of things to happen in this very short period of 5 to 6 years. The only thing that we're worried about is that there were other societal changes happening simultaneously, that we had a big change in the political system, or that other recommendations were changed during the same period that could relate to maternal health or childhood health. And we have not been able to identify anything happening at that period. But we cannot exclude that something is happening, obviously. But we haven't been able to identify anything that happened at the same time. So this is a very strong feature with the D-tect study, that we don't have to control for confounding, and that the differences we see will relate to whether they have been exposed to extra vitamin D or not to extra vitamin D, except for if we could identify something happening simultaneously. And something that is very difficult in this study to get away from is that many diseases have a trend. They're occurring more frequently with time, and that is we cannot distinguish this secular trend that's going on from the effect of the exposure versus the non-exposure. And as you will see when I go through some of the results, that is a limitation that means that we may not be able to see some differences that may be related to fortification, because the trend in the diseases might overrule the effect we're seeing of vitamin D. One thing that we expected could be different in the two periods would be the amount of sunshine. Those of you who've been in Denmark will know that summers vary we have good summers and bad summers, and we have horrible winters. But summers, at least, we have more or less sunshine. And so we set out to examine the mean monthly sunshine hours for the exposed, that's the green, and the non-exposed, that's the blue. And as you can see, there is no difference in the two periods. We do adjust all our analysis for differences in sunshine, but it doesn't make a big difference, as you can also be assured of from this picture. The results I will go through today are results from the D-tect study linking exposure to extra vitamin D from fortification during pregnancy to offspring childhood obesity, to mothers then subsequently getting preeclampsia. So if you, in your own fetal life, did not get sufficient or get less vitamin D, does that impact your risk on later on when you get pregnant yourself of getting preeclampsia? A little bit of a difficult concept, but that's what we're examining. And then schizophrenia. We have also, or are in the process of looking at fractures, asthma, type 1 and 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and a number of birth outcomes. But I will not go through these. I can tell you now we do not see any association with fractures. We do not see any association with type 1 diabetes. We don't know for the other. We do not see any effect in relation to birth weight either. But for the others, I don't have the results yet. But let me go through these 3 endpoints. Whoops. So when it comes to obesity, we use the Copenhagen School Health Registers, where all children going to school in Copenhagen since 1930 and up until 1985 were registered for their body weight and height every year. What we're using here is the measures of height and weight at 7 years of age, and that is the first measurement that these children have when they enter school. So what we're looking at here is the differences in mean body mass index at age 7 between exposed and non-exposed. So the difference here is suggesting that those that got extra vitamin D during fetal life, those who had mothers that got extra vitamin D during pregnancy, they grew up to be leaner than those who didn't get the extra vitamin D. So this study would suggest that vitamin D, that extra vitamin D from fortification, had beneficial effects in relation to developing a higher mean body mass index at the age of 7. However, as we also see, the trends here, it's the mean body mass index set score at 7 years for the years between 1930. This is the birth year, so you go about 7 years younger. But you can see that we have quite dramatic increases. This is the odds of overweight, the odds of obesity, and the odds of extreme obesity. And you can see for each of these conditions, whether we're talking about the number or the prevalence of obesity, or we're talking about the mean body mass index, we see quite dramatic increases in body mass index, which we see all over the world. But these secular changes in body mass index or in odds for obesity, of course, is underlying our effects as well. So we have to adjust for these quite strong trends. And once we do that, and once we adjust, this is the association you saw before, the positive influence, if you like, of vitamin D, that is completely eliminated once we take the secular trends into account. And we cannot distinguish whether what we saw here was a consequence of the vitamin D or just a consequence of those very strong trends that are occurring. So we have to conclude basically that we don't see an effect. Here we are making the same kind of exercise for the odds of overweight, obesity, and extreme obesity, and you can see all of these estimates are below 1. This is the only one that's significant, but it's quite strongly significant, suggesting a lower risk of becoming obese at the age of 7 for those born to mothers that got extra vitamin D. But once we do the adjustment for the secular trend, the association is completely eliminated. So the conclusion is that prenatal exposure to extra vitamin D from fortified margarine and milk, that was in another period, I have not talked about that, but we also have a milk fortification, had no effect on body size at age 7 years. We're also looking to investigate whether the effect of vitamin D has influence on developing preeclampsia later in life, as I said before. And so the hypothesis here is that low vitamin D status in fetal life, in your own fetal life, increased the risk of you becoming, of you having a preeclampsia in a future pregnancy. These are the results. This is looking at the prevalence of risk and to vitamin. Thank you. This is data from Elina Hyppönen's study, and that was actually what made us think about doing a study like this. This is looking. She was looking at the prevalence and risk of preeclampsia in relation to vitamin D supplementation in infancy. In other words, she was looking to see whether mothers who gave birth had a higher risk of developing preeclampsia if they themselves, as infants, had gotten vitamin D supplementation. This was done in the northern Finland birth cohort. And what she was finding was that compared to those that irregularly or never got vitamin D supplementation in infancy, those that got it regularly, they had a reduced risk of getting preeclampsia in their pregnancy later in life, a significantly reduced risk. There was no dose-response effect, not a significant dose-response effect, but if you just look at the estimates, again, you can see from her results that it's quite consistent that extra vitamin D early in life did seem to influence the later risk of having preeclampsia in your pregnancy. So that was the basis for the study that we did in the vitamin D project. So just to illustrate this, you can say, were you exposed in this period where the fortification stopped in 85? In other words, were you born in this period? Then what happened to your pregnancy and you giving birth in the years after? We included only primiparous women, and the outcome was varying degrees of preeclampsia, ranging from gestational hypertension to preeclampsia, and over this HELP syndrome to having eclampsia. We used logistic regression analysis and stratified our analysis by smoking, because we also know that smoking is greatly influencing the risk of preeclampsia. In fact, smoking seems to be protective against preeclampsia, which is quite extraordinary. We could identify 16,000 women who gave birth between 1999 and 2016. That gave us about 1,000 cases who were exposed early in life, and about 1,000 cases who were unexposed early in life, among 16,700 women in total. And we were looking at first-time pregnancies in the age between 14 and 17 for both the exposed and the unexposed. This is just showing you the codes we were looking up in the national registers. This would be in the National Hospital Registry, the codes we were using for the different degrees of preeclampsia. And here are the numbers. We found about half of the women in both groups, both the exposed and unexposed, had mild to moderate preeclampsia, and about 25% had only gestational diabetes or more severe preeclampsia. So these are the figures you saw before, about 1,000 cases among exposed and unexposed. So in relation to gestational hypertension, you can see we had a crude model and an adjusted model. In the adjusted model, we adjusted for maternal age at delivery, maternal smoker status, and parity, and whether there were multiple births. And as you can see, there's really, first of all, you can see that it doesn't really make a big difference that we adjust, which is kind of the concept behind the D-tect study, that confounding doesn't make a big difference. And the other thing you can see is that there's really not much suggestion of a significant effect of extra vitamin D on gestational hypertension. However, when we look at mild to moderate preeclampsia, then we see quite different results. We see significant results in both the crude model and the adjusted model, suggesting that those women who themselves had extra vitamin D during fetal life because their mothers were exposed to fortification, they have a lower risk of developing preeclampsia when they themselves get pregnant. And when we look at the 435 that had severe preeclampsia, we don't see much of an indication, but when we lump all of them together, put these three together, then again we see a significant effect suggesting a lower risk of all types of preeclampsia, but the association is mainly driven by mild to moderate preeclampsia, which is also the most prevalent of these diseases, of this cluster of diseases. This is just to show you how it looks. We have very few people. I think we have 2 people that are forming these 2 lines out here. This is how to show how it looks over time, the odds of preeclampsia among exposed and non-exposed. Then we were interested in looking at smoking as well. There's a little bit, the two groups, this was 16,700 and this was just around 16,000, so there's a little bit more people here, and there's very little, but beyond that, there's very little difference between the number of current and former smokers in the 2 groups. But when it comes, but there is, even if you don't see the big difference, there is a significant difference between. It doesn't look as though there's a big difference, but there is a significant difference in smoking between the 2 groups. So what we did here was to make the same analysis among the never smokers, the former smokers, and the current smokers. And it's a little bit busy, I'm sorry about that, but if you take the mild to moderate, which was where we saw the significant effect before, we see now that for the never smokers, there's really not much of an association. For the former smokers, the estimate starts going a little bit down, and when we come to the smokers, that's where we see the strong effect. And this actually goes for also the severe preeclampsia, and if we lump all the cases together. In all cases, we see significant reductions among the smokers. So, what do we conclude from that? Well, we conclude that primiparous women who in their own fetal life was exposed to extra vitamin D, in this case from food fortification, they had a lower risk of preeclampsia compared to unexposed women. But also that the little extra vitamin D seemed particularly important for smoking women, seemed to modify particularly their risk. So in terms of prevention, that might be a group, if this can be replicated in other studies, this might be a group that could be particularly considered. Now the last thing I'll go through is the D-tect study results in relation to schizophrenia. We were looking at first admissions, incidence rates of adult schizophrenia, and we included just about 250,000 individuals that in this case were followed for 25 years. And these are the results. There were about a little less than 900, well, 800 and something, both non-exposed and exposed. But a rate that you can see already now was a little different. There was a higher incidence rate of schizophrenia among the non-exposed, in other words, those that hadn't got extra vitamin D, and a little lower incidence rate for those that was getting extra vitamin D in fetal life. And here you can see the 2 curves across age. This is the rate per 100,000, and this is the age going from a little more than 10 years up to 25. And the hazard ratio between exposed and non-exposed is about 0.81, and it's significant. We also see a gender difference with more males than females, which is seen in most other studies as well. Now, one thing that we have not considered here yet is the secular trend in schizophrenia. Like with obesity, we do see increasing rates of schizophrenia, and we have not taken that into account yet. My prediction is that it might eliminate this effect, like it did for obesity, because we see strong increases during this period. But another thing we've started looking at is the association in relation to season of birth. This is the serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels over different months, September, October, November, December, and so on. And we see this seasonal pattern that is seen very often in northern countries on the globe. The black or the dark one is males and the light one is females, and you can see the same pattern irrespective of gender, and also that August, September is the time when the levels are highest, whereas January, February, March is the time when levels are lowest. Now we had a hypothesis that individuals born at different times may have different risk and may have different importance, or the fortification may have different importance. So in other words, we hypothesized that somebody who was born April, May, June would have had most of their pregnancy in the dark time. So adding a little extra vitamin D we would expect to be of most importance for children born in this period. Whereas children may be born around here, they would have had a light pregnancy. So they would have had mothers who potentially would have created a lot of vitamin D in their skin, and therefore they would have had more saturated levels themselves. So we hypothesized that individuals born here would run a particular risk of schizophrenia, and also that this was the group that would benefit the most from the margarine fortification. And so, in other words, we would expect to see that in some way we could reduce the size of the amplitude of that sinus curve that we were seeing before. So we would make a smaller amplitude, particularly in the winter time when stores were low. And this is the preliminary results that we have. This is looking at the cumulative hazard for children born May to June, and you can see the unexposed have a higher risk, a higher hazard of developing schizophrenia compared to the exposed group, the ones that got extra vitamin D. This is preliminary results, so I don't know whether they will be stable once we get further in the analysis, but this is what the data is showing up until now. So the conclusion, general overall conclusion, is exposure to small extra amounts of vitamin D from mandatory food fortification during pregnancy did not seem to influence the risk of obesity and also fractures, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and birth weight, as I said initially. But offspring risk of preeclampsia and schizophrenia seems to be lower for those that had mothers that were exposed to extra vitamin D in pregnancy. So some diseases might be sensitive to that little extra amount, which wasn't much, just 15% of total intake, while for other diseases it may have no influence. And if you want more information about the D-tect study, you can look it up, www.detecting disease, DK. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berit. This is very exciting project. The name itself, it's very suggestive, D-tect, and we're very glad we have a full house here. This shows vitamin D is a very hot topic, not these days, but back last 10 years, let's say. And well, too many results, interesting results to comment. I would have some questions, but I would first ask if anyone in the audience would like to make any question, comment.
Thank you for your nice presentation. I have one question, general question. Why the vitamin D fortification foods was discontinued in your account?
That is a very good question, and I've asked that question to the authorities as well. The thing was that there has been throughout time lots of different vested interest in margarine, and particularly margarine fortification. Fortification started before World War II in Denmark. it had been a long battle between the dairy industry and the margarine industry, which were both big at that time in Denmark. And the margarine industry wanted to say, we are making a product that has the same nutritional value as butter. And the farmers said, of course, well, this is artificial. So there was this strong battle between them. And that battle has kind of continued. So I guess maybe there has been lobbyism. There was, in the 80s, and that was all over Europe, a general idea that fortification probably wasn't so good. And so the Danish authorities have in one publication written that they think the amount that was supplied was so little that it didn't have any health effects, but they had never examined it. So that's the official story, but it must have been some lobbying or some political decisions behind that we are not hearing about anymore. Is it you?
Thank you very much. Your presentation was just, a huge amount of data and so many interesting results. And I'm sure we have a lot more to come. I have two questions. The first, actually, I'd like to welcome you to Rio de Janeiro and to our university, of course. It's a pleasure to have you here. And the first one is mainly, curiosity. What happened during the mid-60s for that this huge increase in body mass index and other parameters that you evaluated? But then the more specific one, since my interest is in placenta, do you have the placental data on this? Because there is a strong evidence that placenta synthesize the biological form of vitamin D. So
we don't have any placental data. More recently, they've started collecting cord blood. It's getting closer to the placenta, I guess, but we don't have placental data, and certainly not for the entire population. Is that sufficient? Yes. With respect to the... What's happening? Maybe I need to move a little. With respect to the trends in obesity, because what we have in the school health records are complete data, what we see is what is really happening, which I think is of course very reassuring in relation to discussing trends. But the trend that, I can maybe go back. The trend that we're seeing has been seen before. This leveling off, these periods of varying intensity, is not the first time we've seen it. Let's just get, oops, there it was. So this is the level you're talking about. What is happening here and then what is happening here. In fact, this was preceded by another time when there was an increase, and back here in the 30s there was another level. Up here, starting from 2000, there's another level. So we see actually periods of increase which is interchanged with other periods of leveling off. We don't know the reason for that. We cannot find environmental triggers that explain. It might be different environmental that explain it. But one thing that I think is very interesting is that there's about one generation between these plateaus. So maybe it's intergeneration effects that we're seeing. But it's something we still don't know.
You said that you were just for the trend. Maybe I don't need that. Because of the record. But I wonder if the trend, when you are just for the trend, you take off the effect of vitamin D. Yeah?
That is essentially what we do. That's a consequence of what we do. But we cannot separate the two.
Yeah, because I wonder, like, if there is an hypothesis that vitamin D is explaining part of, and of course we know that obesity is a multifactorial disease, and there is no expectation that vitamin D will explain the whole variation, but part of it's going to be attributed to vitamin D. And then when you adjust for secular trade, it's like you are kind of cancelling your effect. Is there any way that you can take away I don't know. I wonder if the statistician could come with a magic.
That would be great. We've thought a lot about it, and what we've done is try to draw, trends and model. So we're saying, well, there's a trend here, there's another trend there, there's a third trend there, and we're trying to model that into the equation, but instead of just saying it's one trend like that, to be more nuanced, but it eliminates all our association. And actually for type 1 diabetes, for the association with type 1 diabetes, the trend is happening. There's a break in the trend, and it's happening particularly in 1985. Precisely in 85. So I mean, it's so obvious to think that this is a vitamin D effect, but we cannot draw that conclusion. We cannot extend that conclusion. We can speculate that it might be what is happening, but it would not be reasonable, or we cannot justify extending it. But if you can think of a good way to model this so that we can separate the two effects. I mean, we've modeled it with age period and cohort effect, APC modeling, and that we still eliminate our significant results when we do it, unfortunately.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, so just a few comments on the project. I think this is quite unique situation. And we need to congratulate the Danish, the Finlands, the Nordic countries to have such beautiful registries. We would love to have this here, and it's not easy to do the original research. Imagine to have those data sets. I have particular worked once with the Danish bird cohort, and we're not talking about like a couple of thousands, it's hundreds, thousands. And this, of course, makes it easier to explore and stratify. And it's very well designed, the study, and well taught, the way you try to address even having this idea of no confoundings because of the two periods should be distributed mainly even. So congratulations, it's very nice to have the opportunity to explore this with an idea, and this was something was there and needed to be. So this is the first comment, and well, there are too many results. We won't be able to discuss all of them, and I bet you could explain much in deep main of this. And one particular result I'm interested is on the smoking effect on preeclampsia. Maybe you could explain a little bit further why it's happening. Was pre-specified, or it was just something you decided to explore? And well, then maybe if we have time, make another comment. Thank you.
I mean, we know that quite extraordinarily that smoking seems to prevent preeclampsia, which is not something we found out. This is something that's quite well known, that smokers get less preeclampsia. So for this reason, we wanted to see whether there was a further effect modification of the extra vitamin D. And in fact, what we find here is that all of the effect is with the smokers. I mean, that's the only place we now find significant results. We do see a tendency for a lower estimate in the other groups, but it's really with the smokers that we find it. So I mean, we don't want people to smoke, and we certainly don't want people to smoke to prevent preeclampsia. But if they are smokers and we cannot make them stop smoking, then maybe a little extra vitamin D might help them further in their trajectory towards preeclampsia.
So it is smoking increases the amount of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is a vasodilator, as NO, and so so what we are actually a group in Cambridge is studying the effect of another gas, H2S, on the placental perfusion. So it's similar to carbon, yes, carbon monoxide. So it's kind of, don't smoke, but at least take some vasodilators and, yeah, yes.
Preeclampsia data, I saw that it was adjusted for maternal age, because I'm wondering, like, if the lady, if the mom was pregnant during the beginning of the fertilization, so the baby, the pregnant women, would be exposing fetal life, and then she would be born, and the mom will take margarine fortified, so the milk, breast milk, will have more vitamin D, and then the weaning period. So this baby will also eat the bread, eat other things, fortified with vitamin D, until it stops, and then the person grows up, and then she gets pregnant herself. So the exposure is not really fetal, but it would be longer than that. And also the effect of the season as well, because they all have the same
Yep. Two comments to that. We have done analysis where we, rather than taking the entire 2 years before and after, take 1 year, also look at what's happening in the washout period, and then 1 year, and then 1 year, and we see a trend. So that I'm not worried about. The seasonal pattern is a very valid question. What you may have seen with the preeclampsia is that we're down to much lower numbers. We have 32,000 at the moment. Every year we gain more and more. But but I mean compared to 250,000. So I'm not sure we have sufficient cases and in our two groups to do the season variation pattern yet. But it is interesting, and we will do that.
Just a final comment, if there's no more questions from the audience. We just started to explore some data on vitamin D during pregnancy. We have like 300 women with follow-ups, repeated measures. And we've been exploring mainly perinatal outcomes and some outcomes during pregnancy, so blood pressure, mental health, and so on. And we found quite tricky the seasonality effect on vitamin D, even for a country as Brazil, and particular in Rio. So Amanda knows really well how hard we work with the data to understand. So maybe for those that are starting doing a project with vitamin D, is there any suggestion or comment you would make regarding the seasonality, what we should do in terms of either recruiting, going over the whole year, or in analysis, or just some thoughts on that? Oh, sorry.
It's just a general.
Well, if it's, well, it's, we don't need to comment anyway. Well, sorry. Well, it's just because it's really tricky the way we found this effect. We actually don't have a large sample size, and we did it looking over month by month the trajectory of vitamin D. But anyway, well, so I'd like to acknowledge this very nice seminar. Welcome to Berit. Enjoy the rest of the week in Rio. And also to comment that we're going to have a lecture right now following this seminar taught by Amanda, which is our visiting professor here, on clinical trials feasibility for those that may be interested on conducting a trial in the near future. I bet it's very good. So you just stay in this room. And thank you very much for coming, and big applause for Berit. Thank you.
Thank you.